Hey, MBA, let me try that again. Hey there, MBA hopefuls, and welcome to MBA Waves. We are live on the air. This is episode 90 and what you need to know about the FT 2023 MBA rankings. My name is Lucrezia. I'm with my co-host Bara and Krithika. How you doing, guys?
Great.
Great.
Good to see you.
Sorry for the late start. Today we are joined by Financial Times' own Andrew Jack. How you doing, Andrew?
Hi, great to be here. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. And by the way, don't forget to subscribe in the bottom of this window for more episodes of MBA Waves. And if you like this episode, give us a little thumbs up. So let's get started right away. Andrew, you've been at the Financial Times for a whopping 32 years, I think you said. And obviously, you know the organization and its prestigious rankings by heart as the global education editor, which you've been for some years now. Welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about your story with the FT to get us started off?
Yeah, sure. Great to be here. So, I joined the FT actually from New York in 1990. And at the time, of course, it was very much a print newspaper daily. And then, as now, I think with a distinguishing characteristic, which is that it really focused on high quality news, analysis and opinion that mattered. So the big issues relevant for, of course, investors, but also decision makers, whether in the world of policy and government or nonprofits or in the corporate world. So the kind of, this drive to really look at key issues, to go beyond politics, to consider in depth the big trends and developments in the world, as well as, of course, a lot of lighter stuff around culture and so on that we follow, and social issues. That was the big appeal for me in joining. The thing that's changed, of course, has been the explosion of online. And now the FT is still a newspaper. It goes to about 200,000 daily subscribers, but the vast majority of our readers, of course, are online, digital and digital only. And the challenge of that, of course, is obviously this huge intensification, acceleration of the news cycle. So when I was in the print world, of course, you normally would have a story that breaks sometime during the day. You're building up to a big deadline. At the end of the day, the story is set out, printed, distributed, and appears the following morning. Now, of course, as soon as anything's out online, the expectation is to be reporting on it and then building out those stories and analysis during the day. So it's kind of flipped and intensified the work cycle, if you like. The exciting side, though, of course, has been online gives us a lot more information and possibility to interact with our readers and a wider variety of ways in which we can do so. So through not just photos, videos, podcasts, but also graphics and particularly interactive graphics and data sets. And of course, the FT rankings, which and just to say briefly, I worked in different countries and on different areas over the years. I was based in London. I covered politics, corporate issues, accounting, finance, insolvencies. I was based as a foreign correspondent in France, then in Russia in the late 90s and the early 2000s. Then I was covering the healthcare and pharmaceutical sectors around the world. Then I was doing some editing of some of our big analysis pieces, and I launched all of our newsletters and curation services. And then I took over overseeing education in 2018. And since then, my role is a hybrid one between reporting on the big education issues around the world, whether it's at school, at university, higher ed, or lifelong continuing learning. But I also oversee a couple of strategic projects, one of which is offering free access for the FT to high school students, so those aged 16 to 19 roughly, and their teachers and schools, because we see that as an important audience where they're getting inundated, of course, with often questionable sources of information and fake news. We're trying to inject high quality insights and a sense also that we might help enrich the curricula of lots of different school students, perhaps sometimes slightly theoretical studies, by bringing topical, up-to-date, relevant insights told in compelling ways. So we're trying to enrich the curriculum, if you like, and also guide them into the world of work. So that's the high school free program. Then at university level, And for that sort of cohort of people who are at or are working, teaching, researching within universities, or those who are considering going to a university or to a master's program, and then to recruiters, of course, and employers more generally interested in continuing to send their staff and executives back into university settings to learn more or to tap into the latest research. That's, of course, a huge market and area of interest for us. And part of our responsibility around that, of course, is our rankings, which were first created in 1999 and now into their 25th year and have expanded into all sorts of different qualifications and ages. So that's the broad sort of background, but very happy to talk more on education, on rankings, or journalism more generally.
I have a couple of questions about this education-free program. Is that based in England, or is that around the world, or is it in the United States? Where do the high school students get copies, and are they paper copies, or is it the online version?
So it's all online, the way it's going. I think some media in the past have offered free print copies, and the problem is often they just accumulate somewhere and get thrown away and cause huge waste. But also, as I said, of course, you don't then have the amazing access to the sort of interactive nature of online publications, including the capacity for readers to comment beneath articles. As to the geographies, no, I mean, we started initially in the UK, but very quickly we went global. And one of the reasons I've actually relocated my own role from London to New York in the States is precisely because we're very interested in getting to students in high school in different parts of the world. So here in the US and Canada, but also wherever English language media has value. That could be international schools, it could be local schools in Europe. We're very interested, of course, equally in Asia, whether in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Africa, Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia, of course, anywhere where there's enough interest and comprehension of English language to be valuable, whether for those who are studying English as their native language, if you like, or even where it's a second language and they're kind of trying to see examples of clear writing and journalism that again might help in their studies. So for us, there's an obvious overlap with anyone studying a lot of the social sciences, politics, economics, business, geography and earth sciences, but also given our data journalism and our presentation of statistics and so on, charts, those looking at statistics, maths more generally, many other topics that could be of interest. So yes, it's very much, for anyone who's listening, anyone who's in school or has contacts with schools, with people in that age group, 16 to 19, with their teachers, with the schools or governors or others engaged around education, we're very keen to spread the word. And they just can go to ft.com/schools are free to see if they are, and if not, to get a teacher or administrator to sign up to the service.
What an amazing service. And you're so right. Knowing that youth are getting reliable sources is, it feels really wonderful. So thank you for providing that to folks. It's so important right now.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point, because I think, obviously historically, whether in print or even earlier in the kind of digital revolution online, consumers of media would go to, a big trusted brand. Now, of course, so many people, if they look at news at all, they tend to go to their own social media feeds or peer-to-peer references. And I think the importance of stressing, well, what's the credibility of this underlying source? Where am I going? Should I be, again, kind of using certain credible media brands as the intermediaries, the trusted places that I can go to weed through the questionable stuff and get to that with some real rigor and journalistic standards is ever more important. And of course, sadly, the dominance of the social media giants has sort of not only taken over a lot of those who are deriving their news and comment and opinions, but in the process has sort of undermined the traditional business model of mainstream media. So I think there's a real challenge ahead to rebalance both that model of funding for high quality journalism, but also continue to question and get people to think about media literacy, news literacy, the quality of sources, And as I say, obviously in the curriculum, to think about how you can enrich and make more compelling the subjects that you're studying.
And it dovetails perfectly, right, with your rankings, right? Because once you create a relationship with your viewership and they trust you, then when they look at your ratings, like that bond continues over time. So it's really smart. It's a smart business move, but it's a smart move to create that trust with your viewership. I'm curious if you could go into a little bit about the rankings and how they first came about, and whether they were the first of their kind. What was the vision back then, and what was the hope that the Financial Times hoped to achieve by putting them forward?
Yeah, and I should say that if you go to rankings.ft.com or to search online, and you'll see our coverage. I mean, first of all, it's all outside the paywall, so anyone can get access. They don't have to be an FT subscriber. And actually, pretty much for each of the rankings that we do each year, and we do them for MBA, but also for Masters in Management and in Finance, Executive MBA, Online MBA, and so on, we have a publication that goes around it and follows some of the wider trends and some interesting case studies and examples. And in this most recent MBA ranking that came out earlier this month, you can find a little article actually by Della Bradshaw, one of my predecessors, who was really at the instigation of the rankings. So basically in the late 90s, there were a couple, of course, there was US News and World Report for US
colleges,
business schools and colleges. That was pretty much, and then there was also, of course, Business Week at that point had some rankings. But there was a feeling at the time at the FT that these were largely focused on US providers, and that also perhaps there were some limitations in the methodology, or there's some things that weren't being captured. So one of the drivers was clearly the growth of business education in Europe. I have to say, as you know, there's lots of fights about who came out first with the MBA or business education. Wharton claims a role, so do some others. In Europe, ESCP claims 200 years of history around teaching business and commerce. So, it's a competitive space to claim who was first, but certainly within Europe, and then, of course, increasingly in Asia and Africa, there's been a growth in this field. So there was a feeling from early on that there was a need to do something global if you were potentially a relatively mobile student or potential student. Where might you consider going to study? And so Della began this process of consultations with business schools and deans and students, alumni, recruiters and others to try to think through whether this was feasible, what could be measured and how to go about it. And so that led to the launch of the first MBA, and we can talk about the methodology and how that's evolved. And then it led on to a number of those other specialist rankings over the years. But the desire from the start, it was very much a time, of course, with globalization in the late 90s, early 2000s, multinationals really expanding their acquisitions, their footprint, their supply chains, trade expanding massively around the world, and a sense that therefore we needed managers as well as entrepreneurs with that context and knowledge and experience and contacts and so on. And so the rankings were very much designed to meet those needs. And at the same time, also right from the start, to touch on some of the, as it were, societal issues that have become ever more important. So notably looking at both the gender split of students, faculty, and advisory boards, and also the international mix to try to get, for those who valued it, a much more diverse group of students and teachers in the classroom to give them exposure to those global trends.
So that's so exciting. And, I should say that this side of the pond, FT Rankings has been the number one source of information for a lot of people going to these schools. Could you talk to us about more on how it has evolved over time, especially in terms of the strategy and its growth and prominence, and also, participation of many business schools?
Yeah, so one of the inclusion criteria we've always had, first of all, it's entirely voluntary, and we also need schools to cooperate, because we draw our data from both insights provided by the business schools themselves as institutions, and also data from their alumni 3 years post completion of their courses. So the idea is to give a snapshot a little bit after their first job as their career's been progressing, but close enough to their experience so that, if you like, the MBA will have had some influence in how they've been progressing, and it gives them a little bit of perspective, but it's not so far after graduating that the memories are fading, or the business school is perhaps less important in what's led to their subsequent career development. So first of all, it's voluntary. Secondly, all the schools that we allow to be ranked have to be accredited either by the AACSB, the US-led accreditation agency, or by EQUIS, the European-led one, because we needed some mark of basic quality, if you like, and recognition and consistency. Beyond that, there's certain issues around having a little bit of a track record. Obviously, we need to get a sufficiently large quality of data from the schools, and notably their alumni, to make sure it's statistically significant. And then beyond that, the inclusion and the ranking simply depends on how well they perform according to the different metrics and weights that we give them. But certainly over time, we've seen an expansion from US, Canada, and Europe to include some schools in notably South Africa, and then of course India, China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia. So it's gone ever more global over the years.
That's interesting. So it's either AACSB or EQUIS, but not AMBA. I didn't hear AMBA on that list. It's not one of the...
No, I mean, we've tried to keep it as simple as possible, and I think those two organisations cover so many of the relevant schools that it would just add complications potentially to add in additional forms of accreditation. Most of those with AMBA also have one of those other two, or if not both of the other two. So it's not been seen as necessary to add that in.
Okay, so that's kind of getting into the methodology. So could we talk about that a little bit? Like, what's important for the public to understand when reading and digesting this wealth of information that the rankings comes with?
So a few things. I mean, first of all, we've tried to focus as far as we can on outcomes, if you like. Certain other rankings will focus a lot on inputs. So, kind of the ratio of applicants to those who are successfully admitted, or what GMAT or other scores might be at the point of entry. Our view has been largely, the more we can focus on actually what the school delivers, or what the alumni go on to do, is the highest value added indicator to the quality or the utility of the school. So we want data, as I say, that focuses largely on that sort of final, the subsequent career prospects for students. And so we ask them, of course, about their salary and salary increase, career progression. We look at a wider number of factors, but what we're trying to do is sort of use as objective as possible data, and also to try to be relatively consistent over time. Again, some people sort of seem to change the methodology all the time, or it's not always terribly transparent. We try to have continuity to sort of allow some stability year to year. And then we're also incredibly transparent in our methodology. So you can see on, again, the website, precisely the metrics that we use and the weightings that we allocate to them. So as I say, outcomes, salary related, are high up. We ask alumni as well about their assessment of the overall experience, the quality of their alumni network, about how they assess their career service, for example, and other aspects that kind of really are trying to judge what the quality was at the time and how much it's continuing to serve their interests over time. We have a significant weight around academic research, so that's looking at peer-reviewed articles that are published in leading academic journals, because of course universities, including business schools, are partly about that intellectual production of new ideas. And we also then look at sort of course content, a number of other factors that are really trying to get the full measure of the teaching, the operations, and the research aspects of the universities.
Amazing. That sort of dovetails really nicely in thinking about trends. Like it seems like the other side of the pieces that you're discussing now. Like what trends have you seen in terms of diversity and in terms of sustainability, or even other topics that might be coming up? Even like technology. We've talked to a bunch of business schools, and a lot of them talk about AI, right? A lot of them are talking about different trends that are happening now, and it's unclear how much the business schools are really integrating it, but they certainly are talking about it. So how do you see that fitting in with FT's rankings?
So I think, as I said, really right from the start, gender parity and international components were very important, and we've certainly seen a progressive positive trend. There aren't many schools, sadly, that are yet at gender parity, but a number are pretty close. One or two are there, and the overall average trend across the 100 or so that we typically rank each year has been towards greater equality. The international component, of course, it varies very much. If you have, for example, a school in the Midwest in the US, they tend to be a bit more US dominated. Schools in Europe, for example, in smaller countries like Switzerland, inevitably have a much larger international presence. Schools in India as well, of course, also tend to be largely nationally focused, of course, given the very competitive IIM entrance requirements and the like, so less traditionally sort of open to a more diverse cohort. And we make a high level assessment of what we think in aggregate is a good, desirable mix. But of course, another thing that's a distinguishing feature of our rankings is you can then break down and look and rank based on some of those individual data points. So if you're more interested in diversity, in gender focus, in geographical location, in all sorts of other data points, you can play around with those on our site, and you can download it all into a spreadsheet to then do further analysis. So everyone should be able, as far as possible, to make their own assessment and identify their own priorities. And as we know, different students do have very different motives, and indeed it's not just for students, of course, because, as I say, a number of schools will use our rankings for benchmarking and thinking about best practices elsewhere. And then employers, recruiters will use them in different ways as well. So there's a wide variety of possible use cases. You mentioned sustainability. I mean, that's clearly been very much a topic that's emerged over the past few years. Societal purpose, climate change related issues, broader issues around ethics and governance and so on. Now, one of the challenges, and you mentioned also AI, I mean, both in terms of teaching pedagogy, if I can put it that way, but also, if you like, content and specialisms of courses, it's quite difficult to capture because obviously everyone defines excellence and necessary knowledge and tools differently. So to come up with a consistent objective measure of, let's say, both the quality or the intensity of any of those subject areas, let alone the nature of the balance of the pedagogy between teaching cases, capstone projects, experiential learning, hybrid, online, in person, and so on, quite difficult to capture. Although we do measure longer foreign trips and placements and study periods in other institutions that we consider sort of valuable in terms of sort of cultural exposure. On ESG specifically, we have now for 2 or 3 years also tried to assess the extent to which that is reflected, embedded in core courses. And then we actually added a couple of sustainability related metrics this year. So we added a couple of points for schools that have themselves produced and made public a carbon audit. And then secondly, looking at those that have set either the school themselves or their wider university, where they're part of one, if they've set a net zero emissions target. And thirdly, in our ESG course analysis, we've added in a question about whether the schools are specifically teaching the school the tools that would allow students to then go on and tackle carbon emissions and reductions within their subsequent workplaces. So the first two are measures, if you like, about school operations rather than what's directly in the teaching load, if you like. But we think, and the feedback from a lot of the schools is that's also important, because even if schools themselves are not huge emitters of carbon, let's say, the importance of walking the talk, of showing that they themselves are committed, the demonstration effect to students, the possibility for faculty to and students to be exploring in practice ideas around their own campuses, whether it's on, tackling plastic waste, improve food, cutting unnecessary travel and so on, we think is all part of the business school experience that should be measured. What we'd love to do going forwards is to consider more around the sustainability content of faculty research and output and in teaching itself, but it's not an easy measure to put in place.
That's really fascinating, Andrew. And one of the things that I like about the FT rankings is that it allows for dissecting it the way that you want across all these things. And as you said, you're so transparent about what went in the metrics. And another thing that really helps candidates is that there are many sub rankings, like best MBA for women in business, and then like best MBAs for international mobility or entrepreneurship and so on. So, how do you guys come up with these lists, and how do you go about the list creation? And what are some of the important takeaways from these lists?
Yeah, I mean, we do some, if you like, subset analysis. I mean, all of those or most of those reports and sets of insights are drawn or derived from the wider data that we collect from our overall rankings. Sometimes you have to be a bit careful because, once you start going into subsets of subsets, you can get quite small samples, and therefore, it's not always possible to then generalize or draw out trends that are statistically significant. So, our main and ongoing ones tend to be at that global level, if you like, of, for example, the MBA. But where we see some interesting data points, we will certainly derive periodically charts or articles and so on around them. And as you say, I mean, the issues we've talked about, sustainability, diversity, entrepreneurship, are very much sort of part of that mix. And over time, I think I hope we can continue to do more of those deeper dives on particular areas. But very often they'll be used to, if you like, flag up trends or inspire more reporting, which might be a bit more anecdotal, but is then going out to look at practical examples and flesh out the interesting areas. But we're always, trying to collect additional data points. For example, during the pandemic, we asked some specific and additional questions about how schools are adapting, which was very useful in our wider reporting, as well as the modifications we made for the pandemic period of course to courses, some of the aspects of which couldn't be captured in the normal way.
Talking with a lot of my clients, I've even said to them several times that what I call the sub rankings, those categories like, best MBA for women in business and so forth, can actually be more relevant than the generalist, depending on what their goals are. So that's very interesting. I really appreciate explaining that. We had a comment come in before. I'm popping it up again from our colleague, Marlena Corcoran, and she asks the following. Are there any fine-grained analyses you may have noticed that may understandably get ironed out in averaging large segments of data for publication? And then she goes on, for example, have you ever noticed that data suggests that women may have responded differently than men, or that US students may have been very pleased with the program that did not sit as well with them, with Europeans rather?
No, it's a great question. I mean, again, we need to be mindful of the risk of, once we go to quite small samples, about how far we can really be confident of those sub-trends. But certainly, for example, I mean, we do, FT subscribers get a weekly newsletter called Business School Insider. And in there, as well as in our wider rankings magazine articles, we often will pull out some of that data. So, for example, just this Monday, our latest newsletter had a chart looking at the relative proportion of MBAs who then went on to form startups And there's a clear gender divide there, for example, with a higher share. I mean, it's roughly 1/5 of male and about 1/10 of female alumni who then go on to do a startup. So yes, you can see variations like that geographically as well. There are some. As I say, I think you have to be quite cautious when you're starting to slice and dice this data into much smaller subgroups. But it's a very interesting idea and very open to different suggestions, both on what questions, data points we collect, and then how we might look in more detail at some of those sort of individual, more bespoke analyses and trends.
Yeah, I think you're talking, and also Eric's question, talks about some of the limitations, right? Like of the rankings always, right? Because you were saying, you can go down the rabbit hole, but then maybe you're only looking at a really small subset. But are there other limitations that come about, if I may be so bold to ask, in the rooms in which you discuss the information that's being put forth, that readers should be aware of?
Well, look, I mean, first and foremost, of course, everyone loves to hate rankings. Every business school that is or isn't in them tends to be quite vocal on this. Unless, surprise, they actually perform quite well, either
right.
in the overall aggregate ranking, or they can be very ingenious, going back to the previous question on, we are the top school in, name your country, or around
right.
certain specialism or whatever. So, you're never going to please everybody in this game, which is why we try to provide as wide a range, as I say, of data points that people can then drill deeper in to reflect their own interests. We do poll the alumni, incidentally, to get a sense of what they consider important. And perhaps no surprise, actually above salary, specifically career progression in a wider sense, tends to come top of the list. And then factors including salary and gaining new knowledge and increasingly sustainability, for example. So in the data we collect and the weightings that we allocate, that very much takes into account those sorts of demands. But as I say, we've talked about limitations in pulling together data. We've talked about sometimes schools will fall out. Either they don't want to take part, or unfortunately they fall ineligible because they can't get enough alumni responses, for example. And also because, this is a assessment of relative as well as absolute performance. So, even if a school actually objectively increases their performance in one or more of the factors that we weight, if other schools perform still better, that first school could still fall in absolute terms in our ranking. But I think, look, I've always said the data is a starting point. It's transparent, but people should see it as part of a much wider journey. Ultimately, first of all, doing an MBA or another business degree is a huge challenge. I mean, it's costly on the whole. It brings risks. There's opportunity costs of often pulling back from, your work to study. It can be very intense, of course. So, it also requires sometimes a rebalancing and a sacrifice of social time and family time and so on. There's all those different factors. And then there's the cultures of the schools. And clearly those evolve over time. They depend on the random nature of your particular cohort and class, but also on the perhaps longer term but evolving makeup of faculty and the nature of the courses, the individual options you choose. So there's really no substitute for really kicking the tires to going, ideally, to visit, at least to talk to both faculty and current students, but also, of course, alumni, to get a sense of, in the round, what the experience has been like there. And then, of course, location. Do you want to be in a big city, in a different country? Do you want options which provide the possibility to study or travel, be embedded have work experience in different countries or sectors? Do you want a finance-focused set of courses and students, or something that's more, as we've discussed, focused on sustainability or strategy or digital transformation, in which case perhaps you want a school that's affiliated with a wider university with deep expertise in computer studies, for example. A huge range of wider factors that, as I'm sure you discuss with folks, they should always be taking into account alongside any sort of distilled set of metrics, trying to sort of reach all people on the average, but not necessarily providing sufficient information on any particular one topic that'll be most relevant to that applicant.
Andrew, you said something in the beginning of your response just now that caught my attention. Everyone loves to hate rankings or something like that. And sure. And I'm just wondering, thinking back to 1999 when you first got started, as you said, it is entirely voluntary. And I'm wondering was it voluntary from the beginning? Did FT just kind of do this first review or analysis, and then schools kind of bought into the idea? Would you have to convince schools? How did you go about it? And how many were there? 100 in the beginning?
It's before my time, so I can't give you the full inside story on that. But yes, it was always voluntary because it's always relied on cooperation from the schools in terms of the data they share with us, which isn't always available publicly, and then access to their alumni, which is also and always has been fundamental. So there's never been any sense of coercion or requirement or possibility of being part of this, except for those schools that want to be. And the fact that we've had from the start such a high number and quality of schools internationally, I think, speaks volumes to the way that process was launched by my predecessors and hopefully has been continued. So there's always ongoing dialogue, with senior deans and faculty, as well as students and other external organizations that interact with them. So it's always, consultative and open and voluntary.
So I like your...
I was just looking at the rankings from 1999 right now, and I see that there's 50 schools that are ranked. So it looks like in the beginning there were not 100 at this.
So I think, obviously, this is something that builds over time. When you begin something, you're always going to start with a smaller number. But I think it's only grown since. So there's 150 or more that typically might go through an initial step, be eligible, but then ultimately for one reason or another drop out.
There's also more programs now. For example, ESCP, ESSEC, those programs are relatively new, starting in 2010 and I think 16 respectively. There's Asia School of Business, that started in 2016 as well. So yeah, there's more players.
You're right. There are new programs, there are new schools, there's new combinations. There's always a kind of discussion about inclusion exclusion criteria, because again, obviously, let's say even an MBA, as it could be somewhere between a 1 or a 2 year experience. There's different emphases in different places. Again, typically we expect some sort of track record as well. So, it can take a little bit of time to familiarize and align. And then, as you say, this is a challenge going forwards. There's so many now joint programs, whether joint between different business schools or within schools or wider universities, which might bring in folks from law or data analytics or engineering or design and architecture, for example. So, it's quite a challenge constantly sort of trying to keep up with all of these different trends and find programs that are sufficiently consistent to sort of make sense to be assessed in one or other of the rankings.
So I would like to bring the focus back on trends. So when you looked at the rankings specifically this year, what stood out for you, and what would you say are some of the most important takeaways for 2023?
Well, I think one thing, and as I say, that's, as I mentioned earlier, that's one of the changes in our methodology, has been this growing embrace of, if you want to call it societal impact, climate, sustainability. It's a very clear message that students and prospective students are pushing and want some sense of purpose in what they're studying and then what they can go on to do in their subsequent careers. But it's something that's been, to some degree, independently championed and certainly is being reflected in research priorities and the nature of teaching and experiences that faculty are increasingly wanting. And then, of course, from the point of view of recruiters as well, more and more they are talking about values and building a sort of new generation that can cope with the pressures and demands that they're feeling from their customers around, for example, ESG related issues. So they want a mixture of certain skills and values, for example, in that space. So even, as I mentioned, in those areas that we've looked at, including the new ones around a carbon audit and a net zero year, to me, it's quite striking how many schools now are going down that route, are starting to audit, to produce reports. And you see it in, for example, membership of the UN Prime, the Principles for Responsible Management Education network, which now has nearly 1,000 business schools around the world that are affiliated. You see it in movements, for example, around academics from business schools in the RRBM, Responsible Research in Business and Management, where more and more they're saying our academic research should also be both focused on societal goals and think about, if you like, dissemination. So not just publishing in a peer-reviewed journal, but actually getting taken up in policy or in practice outside the business school. You see more and more case competitions that focus on diversity or sustainability or other areas, engaging students. And you see some other data sets and rankings and so on that are very much looking at what students want and how they assess a lot of those areas within the schools. So I'd say that's one of the real existential shifts, if you like, we've been seeing, and both in terms of pressure for change and schools now increasingly responding to it.
Mm. Mm.
And then, sorry, I mean, but the other one, which I say is quite methodologically complex to capture, but there's no question everything around digital transformation, data analytics, AI, as you were mentioning earlier, as the sort of the skills that are really required for the future. So both, some of those core skill sets for younger Masters in Management or MBA students, but also refreshers and insights for more senior executives in executive MBAs or executive learning courses more generally. Those are huge themes alongside the more traditional and still very important ones around strategy and marketing and leadership.
No, it makes a lot of sense that the FT is responding to and attentive to the interests and needs of future students, current students, businesses, and so forth. So in higher ed, two big shakeups I've been observing are lots of criticism, even stepping away from things like standardized testing and rankings in general. Like the SAT, for example, has been under the microscope for like decades now, citing things like it's biased or not relevant as a predictor of success. And even the US Bar Association just a few months ago eliminated the requirement of the LSAT for entry to law school, leaving it up to the schools to decide whether they require it or not. And there are other examples of schools opting out of the rankings, like you mentioned. A very specific example, a couple of years ago when the M7 schools, often considered the top 7 US MBA programs, opted out of the Financial Times rankings in the shadow of COVID, right? Citing that probably there wouldn't be reliable data because of COVID. So what are your thoughts on these shifts and some of these cornerstones of higher education, admissions, and reputation, and how do they interplay with each other?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, that's one reason that we try to focus as much as possible on outcomes, on, if you like, the value added of the MBA or the business school. I mean, we've never used metrics like SAT or indeed GMAT scores on the point of entry, nor ratios of applications to successful admissions, for instance, partly because, as you say, there is I think a very valid debate about, how far those who already have social capital or money or support, who've been able to afford tutoring, have had many other life chances, tend to perform better. So on the one hand, measuring those things is a rather backwards looking and potentially, if you like, certainly not a very inclusive way to assess either the quality of those coming in or the richness and diversity of the cohorts or the value added. Of course, if you focus on a a small group of well-off students who tend to perform better in these sorts of tests on the way in, and you've cherry-picked them, it's not surprising that they will then, be able to capitalize on the name of whichever school and go on to successful careers. Question is, how much has the school really added to them compared to if it had been more inclusive in its recruitment policy? It had focused on really elevating students who had the potential to learn rather than perhaps already having acquired a lot of those skills through their earlier education and parental support. So I think it would be very dangerous to go down that route, and I can understand why there's been a backlash against certain other rankings for those reasons. As I say, it's something we've always steered clear of. The diversity metrics are the ones that we do include, as I mentioned, because I do think there's growing evidence, as you know, that a more diverse group of people is actually more valuable in terms of insights, and indeed better prepares students for the world of work afterwards, which by definition, like society, is much more diverse perhaps than the elite groups typically studying universities. The one other element that we did add this year was to look at the diversity not only of employment sector outcomes, but also for the MBA, of course, most of which have got a professional period before coming. We look at the diversity of the employment sectors they worked in before coming. So, if your class includes some students who previously worked in the non-profit or the government sector, for example, or outside some of the usual suspects that dominate of finance and accounting, that will lead to a richer and more diverse cohort and hopefully experience and learning benefits. So we have included those things. As to the, as you say, the COVID period, it's true that a number of the schools, notably in the US, did temporarily suspend their cooperation with our and other rankings, as you say, partly because they believed that it was quite difficult to capture consistent information in that period when suddenly everything was happening online. And of course, there were wider stresses, including mental health issues and so on, and balancing of work and family with study for both students and for faculty. But happily, and of course, the other thing was more generally, the schools themselves were really scrabbling both with workplace sickness for staffing, adapting, of course, to developing a lot more online and hybrid teaching, and coping with all sorts of other short-term emergencies linked to the pandemic. So understandably, they wanted to really hunker down and focus on their core delivery. But I mean, I'm happy to say that in our case, they all pretty much came back after the pandemic, which I think is hopefully a mark that they do recognize, our commitment to assessing the right sorts of things going forwards in terms of looking at their educational quality.
So I'm curious, is there anything that was discussed at a question or way of looking at the business schools that it's a wait and see? Like, we're not going to do that this year. We're going to see what happens in subsequent years. Has anything come up that is just a marker that you've decided to just wait and see?
I think there's an ongoing debate about certain issues, for example, about the value of shorter versus longer term placements and experiences. I think there's no doubt for a 22, 23-year-old to spend even a week, let's say if they were based in the US, going to Mexico or to, Kenya or somewhere, could be enriching. I think on the whole, we've tended to say a longer term placement over a month in particular is when you really start to be not just, as it were, doing sort of study tourism, but really being embedded and starting to get under the skin of a different context or culture or country. And so we focused a little bit more on that. And that was a reflection of it. Obviously, those experiences physically of traveling weren't taking place at all during the lockdown in COVID. And I think we're still in a bit of a phase of saying, okay, well, what will be the duration and the nature of the quality of those different international experiences or placements to really judge the difference. I think, also ongoing and difficult to measure is this move to increasing hybridization. So, what really now is the definition or the distinction between an online MBA, a hybrid MBA, and an in-person one, a number of which obviously will have periods of physical contact on campus or in different regional centres, notably for executive MBAs, but we'll also have some synchronous and often some asynchronous online possibilities. And there can be some legitimate real value in that more flexible approach, given different learning styles and the ways in which people communicate more or less when they're face-to-face in the classroom and so on. But they're very difficult to sort of capture in a consistent way. But I think, it remains very much an ongoing debate of interest, in the same way as, for instance, we continue to reflect on how best to assess academic research and output. Now, in my view, the greatest impact academic research can have as an audience, if you like, is on their class. Those students, the vast majority of whom will not stay on to do a PhD, but will go into or back into the world of work. So to measure the extent to which the latest breakthrough research and insights from academics is being fed into the classroom is an interesting measure. I think also, as I mentioned, the idea of not just publishing for a prestigious peer-reviewed academic journal, which is read by a handful of people within academia, but rather both identifying research that from the outset appears to have a practical and a societal value, and then actually following through to try to disseminate those ideas into the world of practice, I think are all very interesting areas that, we're trying to explore new ways to measure and assess and encourage, that greater interchange between academia and the world of practice.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And before we wrap up, because we're getting to a little bit over 50 minutes into the episode, I did have one more question. And despite any criticism that people have about the rankings, and believe me, a lot of people do, I hear from my side too, my colleagues who are admissions consultants, whatever the case, one of my favorite things about the rankings is the pressure that it puts onto these business schools to do better, to be great, to innovate, and to respond to the interest and needs of their clients, so students, and society. And I think that's great. One of the main criticisms obviously would be that it kind of perpetuates, this is something you kind of got into, it sort of perpetuates a disparity situation, and there's definitely truth to that. When I speak to my clients, people that I meet often who are early on in the process, a lot of times people who are MBA hopefuls, as we call them, look very much at rankings. They're like top 10 or bust. Like they only want to go to top 10 schools, and they just kind of close their eyes to so many opportunities to schools that offer fantastic things that might actually even be a better fit. And something I like to say very often is rankings are a great place to start and a terrible place to finish. And as you go deeper into your research and find the schools that are the best fit to you, the rankings are less important. Still, I think they do serve something well. And a lot of online discussion, because obviously the FT being it is like kind of the gold standard of rankings out there. So every year there's a lot of buzz about that, and there's a lot of conversation, love it or hate it, but you do pay attention to it. And one of the criticisms is that as it's surveying students, alumni who are just 3 years out of graduation, it's getting a snapshot of the impact that a school that is top ranked would have on you in that kind of short term after graduation. And I do think that going to, say, a top 10 or top 20 school, for example, does give you a pretty good boost in that short term. But in the medium and long term, I really think it's much more about how good you are. Yeah. How well do you work? What do you produce? How well do you network and build relationships? And how well do you communicate about your achievements? So that said, like looking in the medium and long term, I wonder if there's a way, this is kind of just a, looking out of the box question, but to also survey people who are 15 years out, for example, from their MBA, mix that data with people who are 3 years out. Because the 3 years out thing, as you understand, only gets that kind of short-term benefit of the ranked school. Am I clear in my question?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, as we said earlier, I think there's a, if you like, a philosophical and a practical challenge. The practical one is even trying to survey students 3 years out from graduation, it could be quite difficult to get strong engagement and response rates to surveys by email and so on. We're all more and more busy and distracted and overloaded. And of course, I think perhaps you can argue to some degree higher response rates tend to suggest a more satisfied, engaged group of alumni. So that probably is to the credit of the schools that have been more active in using their alumni networks to not just perhaps, as it were, cynically fundraise, but actually to provide ongoing learning and advice and networking opportunities and so on. And of course, there's an interesting demographic aspect that I suspect also people, let's say 15 years out, because they're a bit older, perhaps they're also still more into an email culture than into a TikTok one, let's say. And so there could be some value in doing a survey today of folks who've been out for much longer. But again, to keep it representative is quite challenging. The philosophical challenge is more, as I said earlier, and as you said, there's a lot more about your individual skills and your subsequent life experiences and your successes in what you've done in different organizations and projects since that would end up being more determining of where you are and what your level of satisfaction is, particularly if, unless there is a very deep and ongoing relationship with your business school. So the challenge would, I think it'd be very interesting to get a sense of the perspectives of MBAs 15 years on, how far you would really then be able to attribute some or all of that to what you learnt or who you met, and the ongoing relationship with your school is much vaguer. But I think it's an interesting idea, and it raises that wider point. I mean, as you said earlier, rankings are a great start, but right from the start, they should be taken with a pinch of salt. They should be contextualized, and they certainly shouldn't be the be all and end all. And that's, my role goes wider. We do a lot of richer, broader reporting, some of which might be supported or the hypothesis begun by looking at some of the data in the rankings, but much of it is based, as elsewhere in journalism, on building contacts and talking and visiting and seeing interesting innovations, good and bad, that are taking place. So, even within what the FT provides as a set of tools and insights, if you like, I would urge people to not just look at the rankings alone and to break them down, as I discussed earlier, into their individual priorities, but to go broader, to look at our reporting across the FT and within the business education space, and recognizing that we can't quantify and rank everything. I launched, for example, a couple of years ago, some more qualitative awards. So we just had in January our second annual Responsible Business Education Award, and that was highlighting and hopefully incentivizing best practices, if you like, both in academic research with societal impact, in student or alumni projects with kind of non-profits or with companies doing socially useful initiatives, and also looking at teaching tools, notably around sustainability, whether teaching cases or simulations or other forms of online resource. So we're trying to capture a lot more broad and subtle insights than can be simply done through the rankings themselves. I should say in the narrow area also, we've just launched, and if people go to our ranking site, they can now sign up. We have a free so-called email course, a 6-part email sent over a number of weeks called MBA 101, just offering some insights and resources and advice around deciding whether and where and how to successfully apply, and then how to make the most of your MBA if you do one. So those are amongst the other sorts of wider things that we're doing. A final thing I'd say, just go back to the rankings, is precisely because, as you say, sometimes people can get overly obsessed with, are you number 1 or number 3, or have you switched 5 places? I would say look at it again in the round. I mean, all of the 100 or so schools that we rank are high quality, will deliver a great experience. The nature of it will be very much dependent on the students' aspirations and interests. But we've also introduced these 3 or 4 tiers So, those in tier one, the top 18 or 20 or so, for example, in the most recent MBA, are those that we would consider, if you like, 5-star. And then we have a tier two and a tier three. And I would look as much as anything in those tiers as I would fixate on the individual, rank position of particular schools. You get a great experience in all of them, and use the wider reporting and insights and awards and other stuff that we do in an ongoing way to sort of help in your journey alongside, as we discussed, talking to consultants, going to LinkedIn, engaging as widely as possible with those who've interacted with schools to try and understand whether and where to go.
Yeah. Oh, fascinating. And Bara, I think, has popped up the link there for
yeah, that's great. And you can also see, as I say, if you go to ft.com/RBE for responsible business education, you'll find our awards for the last couple of years that showcase, a bunch of different business schools based on various different elements assessed by largely external judges. And then, as I say, with each ranking, we have this wider set of articles, which also helps to enrich and provide further advice.
Yeah, lots of good data. Yeah, and something I often do remind my clients and people I meet at MBA fairs and so forth is that, behind that 100 list, there's many more schools that are not even on that list. And so, yes, every one of those 100 schools is of good quality and worth your attention, at least checking out their website and seeing, hey, maybe this school that I never thought about before or even heard of might actually be the better match for me in my career.
Absolutely. And I didn't mention, but we're also doing, in fact, tomorrow, our own free full-day webinar, Future of Business Education, which is focused on MBAs. So we'll be talking to deans of some of the leading schools, to key recruiters, to alumni, and also to some faculty with, their intellectual ideas and contribution, if you like, of the sorts that students who go to those schools will benefit from. So, I'd invite you to register. That's absolutely open to everybody. Yeah, you can just Google it, or, FT Future of Business Education, and you'll see, you can just register online for free and join that. And that'll be basically sort of the UK times, working times tomorrow. And then I think it's available on demand afterwards, so people can watch it after it's happened as well. But if you watch live, you also have an opportunity to throw out comments and questions to something like 20, 30 wonderful speakers as well. And there are some individual workshops as well that you can join to go a deeper dive on some of the particular aspects.
Looks like Bara has lightning fast found the link again.
Very good. Thank you. Very efficient.
I try.
Andrew, thank you so much for this fascinating discussion. It's been really interesting, enlightening, and I think a lot of good insights for our listeners. So thank you so much for joining us.
No, great pleasure, and thanks also for those who ask questions. I'm very happy to keep in touch and do more.
Well, hey, MBA Waves, if you like this episode, don't forget to hit a like in the bottom, and for more interesting episodes about business and education, don't forget to subscribe to MBA Waves. Thanks, everyone. We're signing off.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.